Next in your book, another seminal artist who was a contemporary of the Beatles, certainly, and an influence on them, Bob Dylan. Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, a song that really took an entire album side. He's so associated with New York, people might be surprised, as I was, to know that that was recorded in Nashville. And you were talking about playing live. Bob Dylan said it was probably his best composition, and he never played it live by choice.
Right, yeah. And I should say that, in choosing some of these tracks, often it's the interviewees I leave it to. I may come in with some suggestions and say, I'd love to talk about Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. But I'll defer to the engineer in terms of which is the most interesting story. If it's just going to be a standard story, well, tell me something more interesting. So in some cases, that's what happens. And that's what happened with Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands. Bob Johnson, who produced it, that was one that was really memorable to him, of Bob working in Nashville with these, musicians who Bob Dylan's approach to recording was completely foreign to them.
Yeah.
And so, he tells a story about some of these tracks where it goes on and on and on, and they don't even realize there are more verses. They're ready to wind down, and he just keeps going and going and going, and they're just having to follow him and lock in, which is not easy.
Well, that's what's so funny about that story is he doesn't tell them that the song is 11 minutes long. He teaches them how the verses go, how the choruses go, and they, all right, ready? Okay, record. And then it keeps going verse, verse, verse.
Their energy level is dropping, and they're having to kind of sustain it, because every time it's like, okay, we're at the end here. No, we're not.
Well, and add to that the fact that they got started at like 4 a.m. Apparently, he wanted them to go off and wait while he had an idea to write. So he wrote for about 6 hours. He literally wakes them up at 4 a.m., teaches them the verse and chorus musically. They all start playing in the wee hours, and then it goes on and on and on like that. So it's pretty funny. You wouldn't really know that from listening to it, and it wasn't a track I was that familiar with. And as you've explained, a lot of these ones where, like I said, I know the artist but not the particular song. This is why it's the better story.
Yeah, and it broadens things out for you as a listener, right? Now you listen to the song with a different perspective when you know what the backstory is and what's going on at that moment in the studio.
Oh, definitely. And as opposed to Phil Spector's Wall of Sound and Les Paul trying to achieve what you described, this is more of a case of trying to record exactly what the musicians sound like. That was more Bob Dylan's thing. This is what the voice sounds like. This is what the instruments sound like. We're capturing a live performance kind of thing. And again, just like with method acting and non-method acting, whatever works, works. And
then here he is in Nashville, and he wants the musicians to basically show off their chops.
And, that's what's great. Use it all. I mean, sometimes be restrained, sometimes go for broke, and everything works. Well, your next entry, we're talking Motown. I mean, talk about an influential organization.
Yeah.
And also a huge hit. #1 UK, #1 US. Reach Out, I'll Be There. The Four Tops. 1966, and you got to speak with Lamont Dozier. I mean, that's a nice get.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spoken with Lamont a couple of times, and great guy, amazing recall again. And I just love the fact that, and it's captured in this chapter, that there he was with the Holland brothers. Holland Dozier Holland was always the songwriting production credit because they basically produced the tracks themselves. Mm-hmm. And he said it got to a point where they're on a roll and they're knocking out these songs for the Supremes, for the Four Tops, whoever, and like a factory. And they're just on a wage and an absolute pittance of a royalty that they've had to fight over all these years. Mm. And he said, but it felt like it was never going to end. He said it was like a Hollywood movie where someone would be, come out with the first line of Reach Out, I'll Be There. And then one of the others would say, move over and get on the piano stool and start knocking out, the continuation of that tune. And he said it was just like inspired. And they had the feeling like this will never end. Of course, nothing lasts forever. But what an amazing feeling. And I love the fact that he was able to relay that to me.
Definitely. A very collaborative environment. And one thing that always impressed me about Motown was you had great artists and great writers, someone like Smokey Robinson, and they were generous. Like he would write a song like My Girl, which was a huge hit. And instead of recording it himself, he'd go, the Temptations can take that. It's like, what? They just shared. And my God, what a body of work.
Absolutely. And again, the Four Tops, that Reach Out, I'll Be There, the energy of that track that's captured. It's Motown at its absolute peak. And James Jamerson on bass and that whole crew were fantastic. They were so locked in. I just love, the sort of memories of that time where they're competing with the Beatles. They said across, there was this friendly rivalry. The Beatles have just done this, we'll do that. You've got the Beach Boys doing the same thing with the Beatles, and this fantastic kind of friendly competition going on both sides of the pond. It just made for greatness on the charts.
And music that still holds up. Some of the recordings might not sound as polished as they do now, but the performances and the songs themselves. And actually, this particular one does sound, pretty well recorded.
I mean, Lamont Dozier said that, with Reach Out, I'll Be There, there was no guide vocal. Often what happens is the rhythm section, records its parts and the vocalist will just do a guide vocal and replace it later. And in this case, it was like they arranged everything, the background vocals, how it was going to sound, and then they just went for it. Yeah. And even that part where Levi Stubbs, shouts out, just look over your shoulder. Mm-hmm. That was an ad lib. He's just into it at that point. And so it's fascinating to now listen to that and hear that that's what's going on, that this guy is truly into it in the moment.
And you got to believe that they knew when they had a hit. I can't imagine that sound is filling the room and they don't know that that's a hit song.
Yeah, they did, and he said they did. That was part of it. This thing that they're on a roll. They know that this is a hit. And they could even do things like, it's the same old song. That lyric is alluding to the fact that it was the same old song, where they just inverted the melody to make another hit.
Yeah, hilarious. And speaking of Levi as a vocalist, I mean, he was a baritone, and they would often have him sing sort of as a tenor to add urgency to his voice and sound a little bit strained. And when Lou Gramm was on the show, he said, in Foreigner and with a lot of rock bands, they do that too. They want to do the tune in a key that's just a little bit out of the singer's vocal range. So you have to kind of strain for it because it creates an effect and it creates an energy.
Yes, absolutely true. And that's a large part of recording back then, right? Because in terms of the technology, when they had limited technological options in the studio, only a few boxes of effects and things, and they had to push the envelope. So that was the kind of mindset always, like, push the equipment, push the needle into the red, try this, try that. And so the same here vocally, he's a baritone, have him sing as a tenor. That's the mindset, is to keep pushing.
Well, let's move to the next one. This is a band that everybody knows, and if you were to ask someone to name a Doors song, you're going to hear Light My Fire, Riders on the Storm, Love Me Two Times, L.A. Woman, Hello, I Love You. And your entry is the title track from Strange Days. Great song, but as you've explained, the engineer, in this case Bruce Botnick, is the one who probably led you there.
Absolutely, yeah. It's, which is going to be the most interesting one to talk about, Bruce? Which one made waves, beyond just the fact that it's a big commercial hit? Let's get into the recording here. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he came up with Strange Days.
Yeah, their first album was recorded on 4-track. Their second, which was Strange Days, 8-track, so they could be more experimental. Flash forward today, you can have 64 tracks or more. It's basically unlimited now.
And they were blown away because they got, as Bruce recalled, they got an advanced copy of Sgt. Pepper. And, heard that, and it was like, wow. As he said, Pepper convinced us that we could go forward. That we were already there, we're already progressing, but this is like the green light to just keep going forward. Look what they've done. And so, there they are in the studio, as you say, recording 8-track and just going for it.
Yeah, Strange Days, in a way, I prefer that album when the music's over and some of the cuts on that. I kind of prefer it to the first album, and it's not one of the ones people talk about. But Bruce Botnick, and you certainly hear his name, and I'm sure he's got some stories too.
Well, yeah, and again, he's one of these engineers from the old school where he would be literally recording, the Chipmunks in the morning and the Doors in the afternoon, same as Al Schmidt. He told me that over at RCA, he'd be recording Connie Francis in the morning, Ray Charles in the afternoon, and Jefferson Airplane in the evening. I mean, they had tremendous variety, very eclectic careers. And so Bruce Botnick was from that school, and he brought that, again, that sort of well-rounded knowledge of working with different artists. He brought that to the studio, and it does rub off in many ways.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk to him. And next in the book, I guess Bob Dylan is back in a sense. Another seminal artist, one of the most influential guitar players in history, Jimi Hendrix. All Along the Watchtower, 1968. An astonishing recording, even by today's standards, let alone back then. And another great person to talk to who's been on top of my wish list, Eddie Kramer.
Yes, absolutely. I've spoken with Eddie a few times and talk about Seminal Recordings. Here it is. You've got Hendrix taking Dylan and electrifying it and psychedelicizing it, if there's such a word. Just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal recording in that incredible era of the late 60s, where it's now this hothouse atmosphere on both sides of the pond with these artists all peaking and hitting their stride, and again the sort of symbiotic relationships and the friendly rivalry. And Hendrix in the studio is a phenomenon. He brings in all these people, all his friends, all the hangers-on come in, and you've got Chaz Chandler, ex-Animals bassist, as the producer, who doesn't like this. He just wants it to be serious. But Hendrix could retain his focus. And, he was just such an improvisational artist. It's amazing. He could just do it right there on the spot, and it's magic.
And famously, a case of an American artist being or underappreciated in his own country and embraced by another country. And even the chart position reflects that. Number 5 UK, number 20 in the US.
Oh, yeah.
What were we thinking, my fellow Americans, that we couldn't appreciate Jimi freaking Hendrix? But in one of the documentaries done shortly after his death, there was a jealousy factor. I mean, he loved to sit in with people, and he would get up on stage, and of course he could blow everybody off the stage, and the other musicians would not necessarily appreciate that and sort of screw up on purpose and sort of keep him down because he made him look bad.
Right, absolutely. I remember, I think Pete Townsend saying that, when he first heard Hendrix in London at some club in most likely 67, and it was just like, my God, never seen or heard anyone like it. I can't compete with that. I think Clapton has said the same thing. George Harrison certainly said it. He could just blow people off stage. And as you say, then in hindsight, it was all great and it was an honor, but maybe at the time they didn't like it so much.
And one last thing about All Along the Watchtower, Jimmy plays bass on that too. Some people may not know that. And his bass playing is certainly different than like Noel Redding would have approached it. So listen for that. Next in the book, first appearance of the Beatles. And not only do you have an entry for the Beatles, but did you go John? Did you go Paul? You went George. Kudos for that.
Yeah, it was like, come on, let's do something different. It's let's not just it's going to be Hey Jude or whatever. It's like, no, let's do something a bit different. Let's put the light on George, and it's a great story. And it was Ken Scott who engineered, and he had really good recall, much better than Jeff Emerick, I might add. So that was part of the decision making for me as well. Was someone who had, a really great recall of those sessions. And this is an important track in so far as just on the technical level, it's the first one that they record 8-track by nabbing a machine that's in the studio.
And we need to mention to everybody we're talking about While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And also, famously, when the anthology came out, we all heard this stripped down acoustic version as well. An interesting recording in that regard.
Yeah, that was take 1, and beautiful in its own way, and with extra lyrics, different verses. And a wonderful song. And in this chapter about While My Guitar Gently Weeps, we hear about how George originally was trying to do the lead guitar, make the weeping sounds and doing backwards guitar and using pedals and Christ knows what. And finally asked Eric, his mate Eric Clapton, like, would you like to play on it? Well, how can I? What will the other guys say? I don't care. It's my song. Right. And so, Eric plays on it, and then George ensures also that the sound is dirted up a little bit to sound like a Beatles recording. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Now, did people know at the time in '68 that Eric was playing on that? Because I don't know if he was really credited in the liner notes.
No, the only person who was ever credited on a Beatles record who wasn't a Beatle was Billy Preston. But at the time, no, it wasn't credited, and no one knew. That came out later. I don't know how much later, but it came out later.
So they probably just assumed it was George playing it. It was his song.
Yeah, and to this day, a lot of people, think it's George until you tell them. But, of course, George has been on the record, and so has Eric talking about it.
Well, that's one reason people have remained interested in the Beatles, and you can still write books about them and do podcasts about them, because even now, things still come out. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
It really is. As I always say, every day is a Beatles day.
Well, amen to that. So the next one, I guess Bob Dylan is back again, in a way. We have The Band. He's pretty well associated with that. 1969, the night they drove Old Dixie down. You interviewed John Simon about that one.
Yes, yeah, that was a lot of fun because again we're moving. It's all different musical areas, right? Of the popular music genre, but this was just interesting about the band, how that all came together. Recording Big Pink, the album as well. At A&R in New York, which had been the Columbia facility we alluded to earlier with Miles Davis.
Well, it's a song about the American Civil War written by a Canadian.
Oh yes.
There's some irony there. And also I like the fact that he said Levon Helm played the drums while he sang. You would assume that he would separate those, but they all track together because, like as you said, they were live. They know they're going to play the tune live. That's how he's going to do it. You think of Don Henley. I doubt Don Henley played and sang the drums at the same time. I might be wrong about that, but there's no doubt about this. You went to the source, and the guy explained.
A lot of people would be inhibiting for them trying to sing and drum at the same time, in a studio setting. There's something to be said for it, in a positive light as well, in that it unifies the performance, right? It all becomes one, just like a guitarist also doing the vocal. There's something unifying about that. And I think that's what we hear in Levon Helm's playing and singing.
Definitely would agree with that. Van Morrison, Moondance. I always loved that song. And I was surprised by the poor chart performance. There's a few possibilities for that. I think it was maybe issued as a single at a point where everybody had the album already. But according to your book, it reached 92 in the U.S. and in the U.K. it didn't chart at all. But
we're now into the 1970s, by the way. This is 1970.
That's right. We've crossed that threshold. Yeah. And when I said that there were different songs that I was familiar with and not, and everybody will have this when we play chart sweep. Same thing. You'll have this moment where, and in mine's coming up with Elton John, where you get to a thing where you go, oh, I was catching things when they first came out at this point. I was buying things at this point. And you'll have another moment where you go, oh, this is the point where I stopped following pop music. I don't know any of the bands anymore. Moondance, and this is another case where, the engineers, he tells you exactly what mics were used, what the vocal booth was like, how everything was done. And it's interesting, and even if you're not a technical type person, it's still interesting to hear about those things.
Yeah, and we're back at A&R Studios, which I said the previous track, which had been Columbia, and this is with Shelley Yakus engineering, and that's another thing through the book. You get to know some of the facilities and what they specialized in, and the kind of sound of the rooms and stuff. So it's its own story within the story.
Oh, definitely. The next track is Layla, Derek and the Dominoes. And, it's funny because the studio was called Criteria, and their nickname for it was Bacteria. Kind of funny. Oh. But, a lot of people will associate that with England, but it was actually recorded in Florida.
Yes, yeah, by Tom Dowd. Again, another genius of the industry, like Les Paul, in terms of he was at Atlantic Records. He was their engineer par excellence. And I think he told me that back in the late 50s, he already was recording 8-track. Mm-hmm. So that's 10 years ahead of everyone else. And in this case, he was the producer as well as the engineer. And it's a great story, isn't it? It's Derek and the Dominoes, which is, Clapton with this new band that he's with for a short period. And who drops in on the session but Duane Allman.
And they were fans of each other's playing, unsurprisingly.
It's just fantastic to have, the meeting of two musical forces like that. And as you say, they're both in awe of each other, genuinely. It's not the kind of backslapping thing. It's like these guys like, wow, he's going to be on my record. Wow, he'll let me be on his record. Mm-hmm. So it's, again, a very interesting moment in time relayed by the eyewitness, Tom Dowd.
And just to show all the variety and bouncing back and forth across the UK and the US, What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. You go into great detail about how the song was started and how it was picked up and a lot of detail about it. The main thing I think about when I hear that is we're speaking about the vibe at Motown. They were about the 3-minute hit song and about positivity. And then this is where you have a Berry Gordy sort of tangling with an artist who wants to have a little more artistic control and maybe go into some social commentary. And, it's funny because, the song is so great, the artist is so great, but yet they have to, be kicking and screaming against their own, management and structure to get it done.
He's thinking artistically, and of course Berry Gordy is thinking commercially. And it's like, this is a hot topic. I mean, this is about, Vietnam and the shattered American dream, if you like. And Berry Gordy's not thinking from the perspective like, oh, this could be soul music's finest moment, which it turns out to be, arguably. So yeah, all of that sort of backstage politics going on. And then in the studio itself, you've got things that, again, that you wouldn't know, that James Jamerson, legendary bass player, had a drink problem, and he was too drunk to even sit in a chair and play bass, so he laid down on the floor and put down that bass line.
Right. And heavy on the sax and scat vocals and all kinds of stuff that the Motown people were like, this isn't what we do. It wasn't even a matter, is it good or not? It's like, this isn't what we do. And plus, who are you, this artist, to tell us what you're going to do? And, Marvin Gaye held his ground, and rightfully so. So, as you're saying in your book, after a long standoff, Motown reluctantly pressed 100,000 copies. It sells 2.5 million.
Yeah. and then everyone's a genius, right? Marvin Gaye had been so intrinsic to Motown from its beginnings, had drummed on many of the records as well. Some people don't know that.
Right.
So he was a major player at this point. And yeah, he had the clout to basically push through his idea and back it up with, his own musical talent.
Yeah, and he knew it was good, and he knew it was meaningful, and it certainly connected with audiences. And another recording that sounds fresh and, gripping today, could have been released today. And next, an immensely successful recording, #1 U.S., #2 U.K., Don McLean, American Pie. Ranks up there with the Dylan song in terms of most verses. I mean, it goes on and on. I would not want to. It's like, to do that song, you'd have to learn the lyrics for 2 albums worth of material, it feels like, because it's just so wordy. It goes on and on. But, you got to speak with, once again, producer, engineer.
Yeah, both of them, actually. The producer, Ed Freeman, and the engineer, Tom Fly. And this was recorded at the Record Plant Studios in New York. It's kind of great to have it at this point in the book. It's 1971, and what's Don McLean doing? He's basically reminiscing about the history of rock and roll up to that point.
Yeah.
And we get into interpreting a lot of the lyrics, as again, a lot of people don't realize what the lyrics are about. They may pick up a line or two, but we sort of get into here exactly who and what he's referencing.
Yeah, you say everything is as American as apple pie. Then you have Miss America, and he's combined those things into Miss American Pie, which is kind of interesting by itself.
Yeah.
One thing that I didn't know that I learned in your book was the final choruses, sort of the gang vocals. James Taylor, Carly Simon, and Pete Seeger are singing on this song.
Yeah. Just sounds like, a bunch of guys they brought in from the local bar.
Right.
It's like, yeah, come on. Let's, one more time. But yeah, great, eh? What a backstory.
Yeah, I wish I had it handy, but Don McLean had the great line when somebody said, what do the lyrics mean? And he says, it means I never have to work again. He said something like that. Steely Dan had the same sort of thing where they didn't really want the listeners to know exactly what a song was about. And personally, I can't relate to that approach of deliberately mystifying audiences and being disappointed if they figure out what your song means. But you can't argue with success, and American Pie was definitely successful. And this is a deal where I was in elementary or school or something when that came out, but I certainly remember people singing that Chevy to the levee kind of bit.
Yes.
And so, one thing I wanted to track as we do this, and there'll be more of this as we go along, is the arrival of new genres. 1973, Bob Marley and the Wailers, I Shot the Sheriff. Didn't chart in the U.S., only number 67 in the U.K. He wasn't a superstar yet, but...
That's the thing, right? Everyone knows the Eric Clapton version of the song, which was a hit.
It's the first one I heard.
Yeah, but it was like, I want to go back to the source here. As you say, it's really like a new genre. This is a true innovator.
Absolutely. And one thing I learned in the book about that, and I'd heard rumors about this, was, the reggae musicians like to play pretty slow, and then producers like to maybe sort of cheat and speed things up a little bit to sort of make the recordings a little more accessible, they felt, to Western audiences. There's a track, Could You Be Loved, by the Wailers, a much later track, that was intended to be a dance track, and it does sound like somebody sped that sucker up. And these are the things you learn. But I mean, Bob Marley was such a raw and compelling talent. Nobody was going to keep him down. And I knew a bit about, the relationship of Chris Blackwell. Would you think it would be a fair comparison to say that Chris Blackwell was Bob Marley's Brian Epstein?
Yes, or maybe he was Elvis Presley's Sam Phillips.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But yeah, whichever one you want to use, absolutely, is intrinsic, right? But basically, Blackwell, is to reggae so much in terms of bringing it, to the masses.
Right.
I mean, he's been criticized in some circles, for basically commercializing it, but he knew what he had to do to get it heard. And the lovely thing about, this era of Marley with I Shot the Sheriff is, he and the Wailers, it's natural. They didn't add much to the recording. They just got them into the studio and let them do their thing. Later on, when Marley, to me, broadens out a little bit and tries to rock things up a bit more, I'm not as, enchanted by that. I like this. This is the raw thing.
What I've always liked about reggae is it's in that middle ground between slow and fast music.
Yes.
Rock and roll, definitely fast music. And it's sort of, even sort of a klutz like me can almost dance to it. And it's gripping. The bass and drums, the way they interact and they're sort of offbeat and everything. Definitely something people hadn't heard before, and definitely relates to a specific region of the world. It didn't come from anywhere else but Jamaica.
Absolutely, yeah. A very original source, okay? It's not really a hybrid. It is of sort everything, I suppose, is a hybrid of something else, but it's pretty damn original.
And the great thing is those guys, Peter Tosh and Bunny and Bob, they'd had a band for a long time before that, and they came up doing covers of the Beatles and stuff like that, and sort of found their way until they developed their own style, which is cool too. It wasn't just like, immaculate conception. I mean, they grew into it. So.
Yeah, absolutely true.
And then, as I mentioned earlier, there comes a time where you go, oh yeah, I was a music consumer. Well, Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. We did a show where we talked about what was the first album you bought with your own money. It wasn't a gift or anything, and you just took your own money and bought it. And for me, it was that, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I was in maybe the 6th grade. And, here was a double album with a variety of styles on it. It's sort of like Elton's White Album in a sense. And number 2 in the U.S., number 6 in the U.K., I kind of did know because I'd seen, I think, the classic album series that this was done in France. And, of course, Elton and Bernie are famous for their unorthodox way of writing songs. And Bernie would scribble some lyrics, set them on the piano. Elton would read them and write a song like instantly.
Have you ever seen the documentary Two Rooms?
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Where, yeah, they're literally in separate rooms just doing their own thing. I mean, I love this era of Elton. It's obviously the one that I was in my teens at this point, my sort of mid-teens. And, later on with Chris Thomas producing, he had his greatest success. It was maybe a more contemporary sound. But this is with Gus Dudgeon as the producer. And I love those earlier recordings, where it's, real strings and great separation on the instruments always with Gus. Beautiful sound, very clear. And I think this is Elton's halcyon period.
He was the biggest thing going. I mean, everybody I knew dug Elton John. There again, another case where there was Benny and the Jets, but there was also Your Song, but there was also Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. He wasn't a one-trick pony. He had a lot of variety. And so there was a little run of albums there where he was just like, he's sort of untouchable as the pop guy.
And in those days, of course, the charts were so important. Everyone knew what was number one on the charts. Now, I don't know who does, but it's always interesting to look that this was a hit. It went to number 2 in the US, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and number 6 in the UK. But it still begs the question, so what was number 1, or numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the UK that were above this now legendary track?
It does make you wonder. It's sort of like the situation of Strawberry Fields being kept out by Engelbert Humperdinck,
Yeah, but that's really sort of an abomination. But in this case, it also shows the strength of the singles charts back then, that, there were so many great songs competing with one another.
It was so eclectic, and, you had so many different artists that just came out of nowhere and had a number 1 hit, and so many different styles. And as I said, this was my time. I mean, I learned about the 60s music in retrospect. I was a professional musician in the 80s, so it was more like I had a different take on it. I knew how to play. But the 70s, and speaking of, the next one, Leonard Skinner's Sweet Home Alabama, 1974. Didn't chart in the UK, number 8 in the US, another certainly seminal band. I did not know, I guess I should have, but I did not know that Al Cooper produced Leonard Skinner in those days.
Yeah. Of course, you sort of said before with the band, writing about this sort of Americana, and they're from Canada. And with Leonard Skinner, Sweet Home Alabama, most of them are from Jacksonville, Florida. I think was it the guitarist Ed King was from Glendale in California near LA. But, so again, it's kind of funny, right? They come over as these good old boys from the Deep South, none of which they were.
And not only that, the track was recorded in Atlanta, Georgia.
Right.
So like,
Yeah.
you're like, whose home is Alabama? Not the band members. It wasn't even recorded there. So that's kind of funny. But Florida is the South, but it isn't the South in the sense that Mississippi and Alabama are the South, or even Georgia. So yeah, that was interesting. The other thing I always think about with that is the term Southern rock. Like people say Leonard Skinner, Southern rock, Molly Hatchet. I know Greg Allman bristled about that a little bit because the Allman Brothers were often described as Southern rock. And his point was, Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, they're all from the South where rock was born. So to him, saying Southern rock was kind of like saying rock rock.
Yeah.
Rock and roll was a Southern thing. Now Chuck Berry from Chicago is the exception. But yeah, that's funny. The other parallel would be the Eagles. Everybody thinks they're a California band and none of the guys in the band are from California. Same type of thing.
Yeah.